Hello, Geeks Speak. We now return to our last segment of Avatar in the Real World, the 100-Year War. So, the Avatar's 100-Year War is different from the real 100-Year War of human history. For one, the real 100-Year War was 115 years instead of just straight up 100 years. And that war was between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. Not entirely the world, but at least we get to know why the English and the French hated each other before World War I. And speaking of World War I, the 100-Year War of Avatar does have some similarities to World War I when it comes to the technologies introduced in the 100-Year War, and also with some of the tactics used. But like every war, the purpose of studying a war is to look at the advantages and disadvantages of each side to the table. And with the world of Avatar, we have 4. So we're going to go over the strengths and weaknesses of every nation and figure out what these nations would be like in an actual conventional war in the real world. So let's kick off our list with the Air Nomads. Now, seeing that the Air Nomads had no formal military, many people would ask, what would they be? Well, through airbending, the Air Nomads can use airbending for defensive capabilities, but when pushed too far, they can go offensively. But seeing how the Air Nomads' tactics of dealing with situations was find a certain angle that works for them, attack the weakest angle, Air Nomads in the 100-Year War would have fit in this category of being cavalry or light infantry. Light infantry and cavalry would always use quick hits, speed, tactics in order to outflank enemies' weakest positions and basically open up a hole to disintegrate enemy positions. In which case, for cavalry and light infantry, they always had to use multiple methods of approach and methods of attack to either advance towards enemy columns or retreat. What this meant was fast and maneuverability, but this meant little to no armor and or heavy protection, which is why in certain cases, such as in 1939 in the German and Soviet invasion of Poland, you had cavalry that were being slaughtered by German tanks or Russian aerial attacks. So the Air Nomads, similar to the Polish cavalry, would not do well against, say, heavy ambush, which is what eventually killed them in terms of the 100-Year War, or heavy-duty sieges. So they would be your light infantry, but since I'm more pacifist, the Air Nomads in the 100-Year War would basically lead humanitarian missions such as providing food and water to destroyed Earth Kingdom villages, maybe help shuttle Earth Kingdom refugees to safer locations, or to provide reinforcements to lightly defended Earth Kingdom towns in the 100-Year War. But they wouldn't have much of a huge, troop advantage in terms of the whole scope of the fighting. But let's go on to our next nation, the Water Tribe. The Water Tribe is very unique as they had the smallest military in the 100-Year War. Since the Air Nomads had no military, the Water Tribe was the smallest, whether you look at it from the Northern Water Tribe or the Southern Water Tribe. While the Northern Water Tribe had more advantages so that it can conduct conventional warfare, the Water Tribe in general were gifted with asymmetrical warfare. Asymmetrical warfare was basically using any sort of tactic that was unorthodox to beat an enemy that had more numbers or could use conventional warfare. Think of it like the American Army during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Viet Congs in the Vietnam War, and various resistant groups in the real world, or if you're Star Wars fans, think of it as the Rebel Alliance and the very, very small resistance in the First Order War. I have a lot of problems with the resistance in the sequel trilogy, but more on that later. In which case, the Water Tribe showcased how you can make 10 men feel like 100. The Water Tribe was so gifted that they could outflank and maneuver against weak Fire Nation platoons on land, and given their waterbenders, they had the ability to sink, scuttle, or take over Fire Navy ships. Keep in mind, the Fire Navy was the absolute naval power in the world. Not even the Earth Kingdom Navy itself could compete with the Fire Navy. And that was because the Water Tribe had 2 advantages. One, they had time and preparation. We'll get to it in the Fire Nation section, but the Fire Nation, for the most part, did not engage the Water Tribes until nearly halfway through the 100-Year War. So with 40 to 50 years of preparation and or just isolation, the Water Tribes were able to survive more than, say, the Air Nomads or the Earth Kingdom. Even the Southern Water Tribe, which lost 99% of their water-bending community, was still able to compete with the Fire Nation because, one, they had gifted leadership. If you look at the invasion of the Fire Nation, all the main commanders were Water Tribe. You had Hakoda being the chief of the Southern Water Tribe lead the invasion for the first half of it. Then you had Sokka lead from the middle part. They had Bato, another Southern Water Tribe warrior, lead the last remaining half of it. In which case, the Water Tribe showcase what happens when you have good leadership in charge of small numbers. It can make asymmetrical warfare and warfare in general very, very strategically, well, improvised and victorious for those small numbers. I mean, if you look at it from one case in point, the Water Tribe truly was the last opposition the Fire Nation faced after the fall of Ba Sing Se in the Earth Kingdom. So they survived more than the Air Nomads and the Earth Kingdom itself. Which brings us to the Earth Kingdom. Now, the Earth Kingdom has a very unique case, seeing how, one, the 100-Year War most of the times was fought on its soil, so it had home field advantage. Next, having the unique case of earthbending, it had the ability to create defensive positions such as trenches, walls, heavily fortifications, in which case, through earthbending, if any one of these foundations was destroyed, say in a Fire Nation siege, they can rebuild it, reinforce it, and re-enhance it to make it seem like the damage was gone. And coupled with the fact that in terms of population, the Earth Kingdom had a very substantial population size, which means its military should have been huge. How is it that the Earth Kingdom managed to survive 100 years, but ended up losing when it came to military tactics? The first reason is because of its army. As we mentioned in the Earth Kingdom cultural video, the Earth Kingdom, although it was a kingdom, it was not an absolute monarchy. It worked more like a confederate monarchy. So in which case, the Earth Kingdom's standard army, which was its federal army, had to be reinforced by localized militias. Which is easy to do if you're in a kingdom or province that is economically wealthy, politically important, and socially important, such as Omashu. But if you're neither of those three things, then your defenses was looking slim to none. In which case, the situations that Earth Kingdom towns found themselves in the 100-Year War was these three. You could be like the island nation of Kyoshi and have your own militia. However, keep in mind, your militia is not going to be that armed to deal with a large-scale Fire Nation invasion. If you looked at the episode where we introduced the Kyoshi warriors, although fierce in their own right, they could barely handle a small-scale Fire Nation invasion. But if you were in a poor location, but you had some sort of importance to the Earth Kingdom's centralized military, you could get your own the Earth Kingdom would provide soldiers for you, but however, they would be so few in number. And as we saw in the episode Zuko Alone, the soldiers that the Earth Kingdom would send you would probably be morally bankrupt and just purely corrupt, and you would abuse their own power. In which case, if you're in that scenario, you either had to trust your corrupt soldiers or just leave yourself defenseless. Which brings us to the last scenario, which is the unfortunate case for most Earth Kingdom provinces and low-end towns. You were pretty much defenseless against the Fire Nation from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. Meaning the Fire Nation could basically march into your homes, take it over, and then if it's strategically important, they might hold on to it. If it's not, they might burn it down. And this brings us to the second issue, because of its lack of a centralized and orderly military, you had a military that practically had no clear leadership. Case in point, if you looked at the political leadership of the Earth Kingdom as a whole and certain individual states, the Earth Kingdom did not have a clear military hierarchy, or its military was not given high power. There's two examples for this. One is King Bumi. Now, if you looked at the episode Return to Omashu, we see that King Bumi surrendered Omashu to the Fire Nation because he was waiting for the precise moment to strike, that being the Day of Black Sun. While sure, his reasoning to surrender did save a lot of lives of not only soldiers but civilians, militaristically speaking, him being a civilian leader and not a military leader, he did not have the power to surrender his entire military force. Since this is a war, everything's on high alert, the Earth Kingdom military is the people that are in charge of Omashu. Generally speaking, they should have surrendered if Omashu was in the middle of a dire siege and there was no hope of reinforcements or daily supply. No matter the fact that King Bumi's actions did save lives, The fact is, he cost the entire Earth Kingdom, one, its second impenetrable city, which caused a huge drop in morale. He also would have deprived the Earth Kingdom military of much needed resources, ammunition, and also troops. Then you have Long Feng, the head secretary of the Dai Li. Of course, his reasoning for how he conducted the war, seeing how he was in charge of the entire military, was funnel all resources to Ba Sing Se to make it an impenetrable city and to prevent the war or the spread of the war from being heard inside. Because of his whole idea of just making Ba Sing Se the last safe haven of the Earth Kingdom, he pretty much signed the Earth Kingdom's death warrant, saying anything that's outside of Ba Sing Se has to fend for itself. In which case, this meant that Ba Sing Se, whenever the Fire Nation did knock onto the ground, would not have advanced troops or advanced armies to repel the threat in a more orderly fashion. And the fact of the matter is, when you looked at it, Ba Sing Se was already invaded twice by the Fire Nation before the end of the 100-Year War, in which case it only made everything inevitable. Keep in mind, the Earth Kingdom soldiers more or less acted more as heavily armored platoons or heavy soldiers, capable of being on the defensive for long periods of time. However, they failed to go on the offensive when it was needed in terms of making counterattacks that could have pushed the Fire Nation out of the middle sections of the continent and into their coastal regions, which was a mistake that the Soviet Union army did not make in terms of World War II. Now we come to the Fire Nation, which had the benefits of the Water Tribe having good leadership and the abilities of the Earth Kingdom having a very strong military, offensive, but they also had another key thing, that being psychological warfare, as the Fire Nation was able to find the weaknesses of each and every nation and exploit it to its absolute perfection. Air Nomads hit them with an ambush. Water Tribes use constant raids to deplete their waterbending capabilities. Earth Kingdom, if you find any areas around heavily fortified Earth Kingdom positions, take those areas for yourselves, undermine the Earth Kingdom's strong impenetrable fortresses by taking all routes of communications and routes for troops and supplies to basically articulate and surround the Earth Kingdom soldiers to the point where they have to surrender. But another key aspect of the Fire Nation is that they had time on their side. The Fire Nation didn't have a time constraint. They could basically take any and all opponents on at their own leisure. Which is why, if you looked at it from the beginning of the 100-Year War to the end, the Fire Nation was not in a rush. They didn't have to. They could basically take its time with its main goal of conquest. And what's impressive is that they were able to at least make it to the walls of Ba Sing Se 94 years into the war. Well, for one, they had to basically walk from one end of the Earth Kingdom to the next, which is the equivalent of walking from Portugal to China in modern day times, with no industrialized vehicles, where you have to deal with various environmental hazards, weather hazards, and also diseases. Not to mention, you have hostile forces fighting you. The fact that it took them 94 years to get from one end of the continent to the capital is rather impressive in and of itself without the need of industrialized weapons. The one weakness of the Fire Nation was its decisive and divisive royal family. Because the royal family did not have a clear, unified mindset, the Fire Nation was able to fall apart politically. If you looked at the 100-Year War militarily, the Fire Nation still held control of the Earth Kingdom continents. Similar to how, at the end of World War I, Germany still had footholds in both Belgium and France. So while they lost the war politically, militaristically-wise, it was a stalemate. Which is how Avatar in the real world actually works in terms of the 100-Year War. Various factors coming in together to make a whole messy conflict. But luckily, Aang saved the world and provided it with a whole brighter future. And we at Geeks Speak will see you later in the future!